Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, who's also here. And we are very excited to be holding our second teach-in of 2025. You know, as explained at our first one back in March, these sessions are modeled on the teach-ins of the 1960s that provided a foundation for education and tools for action during the civil rights and anti-war movements. Some of you may also remember that back in 2017, after Donald Trump first assumed the presidency, PNP held a few teach-ins to help inform then about relevant issues and advise on ways to remain engaged. Well, now, with anxieties and concerns again running high, we've revived the teach-in idea to serve the same purpose as before. An event like this is somewhat a departure from PNP's normal programming, which is, of course, focused on author talks, but it is very much in keeping with the fundamental mission of PNP and of many other independent bookstores across the country. And that mission is simply to cultivate a sense of community and to strengthen the common good through not just promoting books, but also through fostering a respectful exchange of ideas. The planning for these teach-ins starts several months in advance. This requires us to guess a bit about which themes will still be current and of interest to all of you by the time the discussion arrives. We figured that the Trump administration's assault on free expression through its attacks on universities, law firms, and media organizations wasn't going to abate anytime soon, and we were right. Fortunately, for the purposes of this evening's event, but unfortunately for our country. We're very grateful for the willingness of our panelists to participate. Each can speak authoritatively about one aspect or another of the current challenges to free expression. Many thanks also to all of you for coming and to all those watching on PNP's live stream link. Moderating the discussion will be Ally Coll, an assistant professor of law at the City University of New York, where she teaches about the constitutional separation of powers, the modern administrative state, and the federal court system. Ally also has been a litigator in private practice and spent time on Capitol Hill as an aide in both the House and Senate, and she'll be introducing the panelists. So Ally and our panelists, come on out.
Well, thanks, Brad, and thanks to all of you, the real heroes, for braving this heat to join us tonight for this important discussion, and welcome to all of those who are joining us via the live stream as well. Some of you may have participated in the first teach-in that we held back in March. That was a conversation about some of the very early Trump administration actions with a focus on civil rights, civil liberties, and the rule of law. And tonight's conversation is going to pick up on many of those themes, but also dig a little bit deeper into some of the more recent actions that you heard about from Brad, many of which were just happening right in March when we had the first teach-in and have been percolating since then. And as you can see, we have an amazing group of people to help us learn more about what's going on the current attacks against law firms, against universities, and against the media and the press. And I'm going to introduce everybody here in just a minute. Before I do that, I'll just remind you we will have some time for audience questions toward the end of the event. So if you want to think about what you might like to ask our panelists, please do so. I will ask that you come up. There's 2 microphones here in the front of the room, and I'll let you know when we're about to turn to the questions section of the program. You can come up to the mic to ask your question, and I would just ask that you hold your questions until we get to that part of the program. So with that, I'll introduce Kara Swisher, who is the host of the podcast On with Kara Swisher, and the co-host of the Pivot podcast with Scott Galloway, both of which are distributed by New York Magazine. She was also the co-founder and editor-at-large of Recode and a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, and she has also worked for the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. She is the author of 3 books, including Burn Book, A Tech Love Story, which was published last year in 2024, and which we have copies of for sale here in the bookstore tonight. Bill Treanor is the Executive Vice President of Georgetown University, Dean of the Law Center, and the Paul Regis Dean Leadership Chair. He's the recipient of many awards and an expert in constitutional law, property, criminal law, intellectual property, and legal history. So much so, in fact, that his scholarship has been cited 3 times by the Supreme Court. And he is at work now on a new book, which it sounds very timely, called Fathers of the Constitution, Triumph, Tragedy, and the Creation of the American Republic. And Don Verrilli is a partner with the law firm Munger, Tolles & Olson and the founder of the DC office of the firm. He is one of the nation's premier Supreme Court advocates, having served as Solicitor General of the United States during the Obama administration from June 2011 to June 2016. And as is of particular relevance to our discussion, he recently led an amicus brief effort on behalf of the plaintiff law firms that were challenging the Trump administration's executive orders targeting law firms, and was able to gather more than 800 signatures for that important brief. So, Don, I thought we would start there. This brief was a part of the litigation that was initiated after the Trump administration issued a series of executive orders, the first targeting Perkins Coie, but then going on to target other individual law firms, including Wilmer Hale and Paul Weiss, but not limited to those either. These executive orders, they subjected the firms to a series of measures, which your brief called a draconian punishment. And so I thought maybe we could start, we'll get to the what was in the executive orders and what the legal arguments were, but I thought maybe we would just start with the why. Why these specific law firms, but then also more generally, why the legal profession as such a major focus for the Trump administration at the outset of this term?
Sure, happy to start there. You know, I think it's important, you know, it's not lost on anybody here, I'm sure, but not to lose sight of just how extraordinary these executive orders were. You know, we can talk about the specifics of them, but the idea that the President of the United States would wield the executive power in this way to single out firms that were in disfavor with him for reasons we'll talk about, and issue these executive orders purporting to take steps that would really destroy their ability to practice law and represent their clients. I mean, you know, nothing like that has happened in American history before. It was a really extraordinary thing, and now that we're a few months into it and so much else has happened, you know, we have this tendency to kind of let things fade into the background and sort of forget about this. But you know, it was absolutely remarkable. And you know, as you said, Ally, several firms were singled out, and they were essentially singled out because, in some way or other, the law firm had engaged in activities that had crossed President Trump. Their lawyers were either involved in activities in 2016. That was the Perkins Coie firm that, you know, was allegedly involved in activities to try to undermine Trump's effort to win in 2016. Others allegedly involved in efforts to try to undermine Trump's claims in 2020 that he had won the election. You know, there were these particular, or in the case of Paul Weiss, that they had one of the prosecutors who had joined the New York Attorney General's office and tried to prosecute Trump, and it was all just personal vendettas. That's how the subjects were picked out. In fact, in addition to the amicus brief you mentioned, I also represented one of the 4 law firms that challenged executive order, the Sussman Godfrey firm. And that firm, you know, they got singled out because they brought the defamation actions against Fox News and One American Network and all that based on, you know, representing Dominion voting. And while I'm sure this is just a coincidence, the Sussman Godfrey executive order was issued the day after Mike Liddell of My Pillow fame, who is one of the defendants in one of those defamation actions, visited the Oval Office. So, you know, that's kind of what we're talking about here. But of course, you know, those are the specifics, but they obviously had a much more significant purpose, which was to try to intimidate the legal profession into not engaging in the kinds of representations that the legal profession engaged in, you know, you know, really across the board. All kinds of different law firms in Trump's first term did pro bono work, representing immigrants and, you know, engaging in all kinds of pro bono work to try to push back against the excesses of the first Trump term. It's just obvious what the point of this was. It was to intimidate law firms into not doing that again, to keep them on the sidelines, and to try to send a clear message that you try to do again what you did before, you're going to pay a very heavy price. It's obvious what was going on. You know, we can talk about the legal specifics, but that's obviously what this was about.
And to some extent, it was effective, right? There were firms that were named that made negotiations with the Trump administration to do pro bono work for them. The legal challenges so far have been successful in getting judgments on some of the arguments you raised in your brief. So your brief argued that these executive orders violate the First Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, separation of powers principles, and the very rule of law itself was, I think, the way that it was put in your brief.
Yeah.
Do you want to walk us through a little bit what was legally problematic about these orders?
Well, sort of what wasn't legally. We probably could have added the Second and Third Amendments too, you know. So look, first of all, it's in each of these instances, when you read the executive order says, like, it's a kind of remarkable thing. In the first paragraph of each executive order, it basically said, you know, I, President Trump, am exercising my authority in retaliation for your representation of clients X, Y, and Z. You're engaging in pro bono work that's against the public interest. You're undermining national security by the litigation you bring. So right on the face of every executive order was a series of allegations that the law firm had, by representing its clients, had done something terrible. But of course, representing your clients is a First Amendment activity. You go to court and you make arguments on behalf of your clients, and the legal system depends on your ability as an advocate to do that effectively and robustly on behalf of your clients. It's protected speech under the First Amendment. And so it was a pretty straightforward case that these executive orders were imposing terrible punishments on these law firms in retaliation for the speech in which they engaged. There's another sort of fundamental First Amendment problem, which is, you know, one fundamental precept of the First Amendment is that government can't engage in viewpoint discrimination. It can't seek to tilt the public discussion or dialogue by favoring one set of ideas and trying to disfavor or punish another set of ideas. That's obviously what these orders were doing, right? They were saying, we don't like the speech in which you engage, and so we're going to punish you. So obvious viewpoint discrimination. Then, of course, what these orders were doing also was interfering with the rights of clients out there to choose who their lawyers were. You know, all of these law firms had been chosen by clients, thousands and thousands of them, in fact, to be their advocates in court. And these executive orders were trying to make it impossible for the law firms to carry out that responsibility on behalf of their clients. So it was violating the client's interest. Then, these orders inflicted very substantial harms, or were trying to inflict very substantial harms on the law firms without any process, without any ability in the law firm to argue that it shouldn't be subject to this kind of sanction, without any, in fact, in the case of the law firm I represented, Sussman Godfrey, even without any advance notice whatsoever, just, Mike Liddell went to the Oval Office, the next day, boom, executive order comes out. So really lack of due process. And then beyond that, the separation of powers issue you mentioned is sort of like, you think about the way our system is supposed to work. If an entity is going to be subject to these kinds of sanctions, there's a process for that. The executive branch, the Congress passes a law that says, this is that creates prohibitions. The executive branch decides that some entity out there in the world has violated the law that creates the prohibitions, and it goes into court and it tries to prove it. But you had none of that here. You just had the executive branch acting as legislature, executive, and judiciary, and just imposing these, really draconian punishments on the law firms, really in defiance of everything that we think of as the way, everything we think of in terms of the way that our system should operate and what the rule of law means.
And we can come back to sort of what the current status of all of that is in a minute, but I wanted to ask Bill, especially related to these First Amendment issues that Don just raised. Around the same time, you were personally on the receiving end of a similar but slightly different kind of attack. You received a letter from then acting U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, Ed Martin, who wrote to you in your capacity as Dean of Georgetown Law Center, asking whether Georgetown had eliminated, quote, all DEI from your law school and its curriculum, and said that he was inquiring about that because they planned as an office that they would not consider internship applications, fellowship applications, job applications from any student who was coming from any school that did have DEI in its curriculum. So, this is a major legal employer in the area where your law school is, and I wonder if you could just start by telling us what went through your mind when you got that letter, and then you wrote an incredibly courageous response, which I hope you'll share more about with those who might not have read it themselves, but it gave me a lot of hope in that moment, and I think really made a difference for others who have been on the receiving end of these attacks moving forward. So, what went through your mind, and how did you come up with the response that you ended up sending?
Well, I have to say, first, I was shocked. So I have a copy of the letter here. And, so we got an attachment to an email. And it said, have you eliminated all DEI from your school and its curriculum? Second, if DEI is found in your courses or teaching in any way, will you move swiftly to remove it? And then he said, if I'm not satisfied with what you're teaching, I'm not going to employ your graduates, and I'm not going to give your students internships. And I have to say, when I got it, I was shocked. And my first reaction was, this is a hoax. Because, first of all, it's supposed to be a letter from the interim U.S. Attorney, and it has literally no legal citations. And then, at the top, it says U.S. Department of Justice, Edward R. Martin, Jr., United States Attorney. He was not the U.S. Attorney. He was the interim U.S. Attorney. So it's like, how could he have false letterhead? And then if you look at it, and again, it's on the web. After he has his name on the other side, he says, it's the Department of Justice insignia, and the seal. It looks like about a 7th generation Xerox. So it's all kind of fuzzy. So my first reaction was, and I said this to my staff, this is clearly a hoax, because no prosecutor is going to tell a law school what it can teach. And I said, let's get our threat assessments person, because can you hack a DOJ email account? And I think that also, that gives you a sense of the time in which we live, that, first of all, a university has a threat assessments person, and that I know them. But then they convinced me that this was actually genuine. And then I was appalled, because I think one of the things that, we're all, So, what we're seeing right now is democracy is under attack in the most profound ways. And I think, one thing that's great about the way in which you've organized this, it's law firms, it's universities, and the media, which are centers of opposition, and they're very systematically, each of them is being attacked. And so I think one of the things we were all trying to figure out is where are the red lines? What can't be crossed? As I thought about this letter, it's like there were so many red lines that couldn't be, that you just had to stand up and say, this cannot pass. So one is, we're a Catholic and Jesuit law school. We have a commitment to, inclusive dialogue, to hearing all the voices. That's a moral and spiritual imperative. And what you're saying to us is we can't follow our mission. It's also saying that a university can't teach, that the prosecutor decides what a university teaches. And that's so clearly unconstitutional. You had David Coll at your last session. He litigated a case, before the court last year in which the court said private entities have First Amendment rights. That was a case involving the NRA. And it's long established that universities have First Amendment rights. There's a Frankfurter decision, often quoted. Frankfurter wrote New Hampshire versus Swayze, and it says universities have a First Amendment rights to determine what they teach. And then, on top of it, you're holding our students hostage. You're essentially saying, your students, we're not going to employ them because they've chosen to come to Georgetown Law. And so we're going to hold them hostage until you give me what I want. And so this was clearly something that we had to fight back. It was a clear decision, but these are not decisions that at this time you take lightly. Because among other things, you're dealing with I think as you were talking, an administration that is incredibly vengeful for anybody who stands up, and it's also a time in which there's personal threats. Before I sent my letter, my wife Allison, who's here, and I said, is this something that I can send? Because you have to realize there is personal risk involved in this. And after I sent my letter, I, like the judges, got pizza delivery. And this was before it started to, that I knew about this. And I called up our threat assessment person. I said, I'm sure this is a coincidence. But, we got a pizza delivery that we didn't order. And she said, there are no coincidences. So, so these are, you do not lightly do this because, at every level it really is a threat. So, I wrote a letter, and, the two basic points are, Georgetown is a Catholic and Jesuit university. We determine our mission. Our mission is to be inclusive, to listen to everyone. We learn from dialogue. That is our spiritual and moral mission. And you are saying we cannot follow it. And you are violating the First Amendment because universities have a constitutional right, unquestionably, to determine what they teach. So, so I wrote the letter, and, as you do, ran it by the president and the board of trustees who signed off on it. I spoke to kind of constitutional experts to make sure that they agreed with me. David Coll was one. And then I sent it out. And when you're in a position like this all the time, whenever you do something like this, you expect you'll get some positive, you get some negative responses. So actually, one of our associate deans, Anjali Patel, is here, and she said, "How can you be in these positions for a quarter of a century?" And I said, "Well, the key to that is I never look at social media." Because sometimes it'll be positive and sometimes it'll be negative. So we sent it out, and to my astonishment, literally every response I've gotten was positive. every response. I mean, it just from every sector, from the most conservative to the most liberal, from people around the world. I just received, a couple weeks ago, I received a petition that 18,000 people had signed that said that, we're Christians and you're standing up for us. And they gave us 400 pages of comments. I've got another copy.
I'm dying to know how the pizza was. But
Yeah.
Go ahead.
We didn't actually have it. You never know. But that was, on retrospect, if it happens again, we'll reconsider. But it was very, very reaffirming. The kind of the incredibly positive responses from everyone. Now, the one thing I would notice, and this is the one thing that I'm a little bit irked about, is when I wrote it and then I read it to Allison. And Allison is always the person who I run by all of my everything I do that's hard, so I can share the blame. And she said, "Call him interim U.S. attorney." And call. And she said, "Call him interim U.S. attorney more than once." So as I'm getting the response, people say, good on the constitutional law, good on the Jesuit mission. What we really loved was that you called him interim U.S. attorney. So I'm in Allison's debt, but I am a little bit irked by that aspect of the response. But again, it's very striking and it's affirming. So Anjali came to me and she said, "I know you never look at social media. You can look at social media." So and I think one thing just from this group, as you're thinking about, when somebody does something like this, it really matters that you know that you're not standing alone. So that kind of feedback counts so much.
Yes, and to the point about, yes, round of applause for that. One more thing on the acting U.S. attorney. So he was acting, and his nomination, may be related to this exchange with you, has now fizzled in the U.S. Senate and I think been withdrawn. And there's some clarity he's not going to be confirmed as the U.S. attorney in the end. So just to close the loop on that. So we'll come back to the questions around what this means for other institutions, because since Martin is no longer the acting U.S. attorney, maybe this specific threat to Georgetown is somewhat abated thanks to your response. But obviously this broader attack on universities is not stopping, and we've seen, especially Harvard, have the retaliation in multiple ways back and forth as they've tried to stand up to these attacks. So I want to ask you about that as well. But first, Kara, I want to turn to you about the attacks we're seeing on the media. And I thought this was a really interesting connection that Don just raised about the law firms being targeted for the defamation suits that they're representing. The attacks on the media, unlike maybe the law firms and the universities, are not as new. They've been a feature of the Trump administration and campaign since the very beginning, so much so that you've said that Trump's favorite sport is bashing the press. But they've also taken a new turn, as you've been talking about on your podcast in this term: FCC investigations, defamation suits that Trump's been filing, these executive orders terminating Voice of America and funding for NPR and PBS. So how do you see this evolution? And you've said these are not just attacks on the press, but also on the broader right to freedom of expression. So how are you seeing this thread evolve over your time as a journalist, and what should we all be thinking about?
Well, it's not new, and it's also not limited to Donald Trump, by the way. The press has been attacked by politicians since the beginning of time. I mean, one of the big cases, and I'm not a lawyer, in the early colonial days was about a reporter, right? One of the big, Peter Sanger, thank you. And so this is not a new, fresh thing. They jailed him, I think, and used things like sedition and things like that. So this is not a fresh thing. And media has been under pressure since the very beginning, either for lots of different reasons. Sometimes they are actually wrong, right? And sometimes deserving of scrutiny. In this case, the problem that we have with Donald Trump, two things that struck out at me you were saying is one, a lot of people use the term unprecedented all the time, right? But it's precedented at this point. Like I'm often when reporters are like call me and they're like, "Can you believe that?" I'm like, "Yes, I believe it." Like, if he did something nice, I'd be like, "That's unprecedented that he did something decent." And so that's one of the things that we have to get in the frame of mind not to be shocked at every minute, because the whole game here, one of the things Donald Trump is good at is media. He's fantastic at it. And one of the early columns I wrote in the New York Times when I was writing there was he's the best internet troll of all time. And every different president has a skill. FDR with radio, JFK with television, and Trump is really good at social media. You can insult him all you want, but he's good at it, and because he's genuine, he's very clear, he speaks directly to people, he writes in all caps, and which I was like, the press is like, he wrote in all caps. I'm like, he does it all the time. Like, you have to sort of get used to this guy is a real impresario of the media, and he has been since The Apprentice. And before that, it was all fucking nonsense. It just didn't matter, right? It was all like, I'm building the biggest building, I'm doing this. And it's the exact same tactics that he used then. It just matters now because it has to do with some, who cares if he builds a stupid building and ruins it in Atlantic City, except the people of Atlantic City. Now it's a much bigger thing. And so I think a lot of what he's doing now is because he loves the media so. Like, it's a weird thing. He has a weird love-hate relationship with the media, but he loves them. Like, he needs their attention, and he obviously, everyone from someone like Maggie Haberman, who he was like, I've never heard of her, and by the way, I hate her, and all this, which is really funny. But one time he's like, I've never heard of her, and I'm at dinner with her, the phone rings, it's Donald friggin' Trump, like calling her, hey, how you doing, like wanting to gossip. So it's all just fake. It's all performative, a lot of it. But unfortunately, what's happened in the performance and making the fake personalities that called into the press, I mean, the whole thing is the exact same thing writ large. And so he spends an enormous amount of time and has gotten very good at both manipulating the media, creating media, understanding what works, and keeping us in a constant state of unprecedented. So like this week, like what was last week? Something else, like I forget, but it was bad, right? But you don't remember it, and so he's keeping you, so he dovetails perfectly into the internet economy, which is about a constant virality, a constant heat, a constant movement forward to the next thing, creating, and it's a terrible term in the internet, but snackable moments that then people, sort of bread and circuses if you're going back to Roman times, but it's keeping people in, and especially the press, enthralled by that kind of thing. And so I'm always sort of fascinated. The press bites every time with a lot of his stuff. And some of it is very serious, but much of it is spending time when he says nutty things on social media or he insults someone like this week it was, calling Anderson Cooper Allison Cooper, which is like, how old are you, 12? Like, even a 12-year-old wouldn't do that dumb joke. But he does that, and then people lean into it. And so I think one of the things the media does that really, there's been amazing reporting on a lot of the stuff that he's actually doing. And they tend to use the phrase distraction. He creates a distraction. And it was sort of perfected by Steve Bannon, who is brilliant at media, by the way. A terrible, horrible person. He looks like an unmade bed, but that's besides the point. He's brilliant at it, And so what they do is they flood the zone. This is not a new thing, and it's a propaganda effort. They flood the zone and continue to flood the zone. So you don't know which way is up, for one. You don't know what the misinformation is or what isn't. You can't find the facts among it, and then you spend all your time cleaning up the mess that you don't actually focus on the thing. And today's media, because of the internet, because of the hair triggerness, because of social media, which right now, social media just passed regular media as the way most people, it was already headed that way. It's so obvious. And they don't have any standards whatsoever. If you think Mark Zuckerberg even understands the First Amendment, I know he doesn't, actually. He actually gave a speech at Georgetown a couple of years ago, and I almost ran the stage, and I'm like, read it. It's short, it's first, it's easy. Can you just friggin' read it? Like, he didn't, I can't make any laws. I'm like, actually, you can. The government can't. It says the government can't. Like, you sit there. And so they have no sense, the people that are actually in charge of these things have no sense of responsibility. They have no sense of anything other than shareholder value, And now media companies are also getting into that game because they're getting killed by the Facebooks and Googles of the world. And so they're starting to make the deals. And that's the real danger except that nobody's watching those things, right? That's the thing, is their businesses are declining really precipitously, whatever. And so they're just like, ugh, we got to give in. We got to give him the $15 million to shut him up, like he's like a toddler, and you have to give him a donut or something. But they're doing that, and it's really dangerous. It's incredibly dangerous, and it puts legacy media on its back foot, and it was already on its back foot. And so one of the things that I do see that's heartening is that there's all kinds of media now that's very good, that's starting to, and the main media of the New York Times, which has been doing a good job, whatever you think of their headlines, and I know people get mad about it, whatever, it's just one publication. But there's a lot of really good work still being done by both individuals who are doing stuff, people on social media. There's some really great analysts, including legal scholars. You're getting a taste of all kinds of expertise, and some of the mainstream media that is holding firm to this kind of nonsense, which is pushing back. I will say the New York Times, I was just with someone there, and they're like, we're now pushing back on everything. That they used to just say nothing and be very stately and very New York Times-y of like, we will say nothing, we stand by reporting. And now they're more in a, screw you, we're right. Like, come at us. They did that with the Elon drug stuff. They did that they're doing it now much more. If you notice, the reporters are like, and he's a liar. Like, this is, or just recently, for example, Elon said he hadn't seen a computer in a year, which was demonstrably, provably a lie. And they just said that. They're like, demonstrably a lie. Here's him using a computer, right? And here's a picture of him using a computer. So I think one of the things that's happened is a lot of the media the good media has become more pugnacious, more in your face and stuff like that, to push back against it. But it's incredibly difficult right now to be in the media system because Trump is so entertaining. He's so good at it. And that was from the start. And I'll end on this, is when he came down that stupid elevator, the short elevator, by the way, the golden elevator, whatever he did. It was interesting. It was an interesting thing to do, and visually, he understood the visuals of it. Because we're in a visual age, by the way, in a much more visual age, in a different way than we used to be. And I had been someone who was a fan of The Apprentice, not because I thought it was actual business, but it just was entertaining to me. And so I watched every single episode of The Apprentice, every single one, right? So I have a very good sense of this guy and his tricks and all kinds of things. And I was at a dinner party with all these Washington reporters, all these traditional Washington reporters who could loosen up a little bit, honestly. And they were like, oh, it's such a circus. It's such a ridiculous thing. He's just an entertainer. And even Arianna Huffington had put Donald Trump's candidacy into the entertainment section, right? Instead of covering him. They did. Go look it up. And I was there. I'm like, really? I think he's going to win. And people are like, oh, that's ridiculous. How ridiculous. Jeb Bush. I'm like, Jeb Bush has like the charm of a wet noodle. Like, no, the new age requires entertainment. It requires a certain Huey Long-like characteristic. And I was like, none of you see him. And I said, but he's incredibly popular. And that show gave him an image, one, of a successful business person, which he really isn't. Two, he's an aspirational version of a rich person, which he really isn't, unless he's cheating at any one point. And sort of a sense of humor that he really had. He doesn't have it anymore as much, which is why people are sort of souring on him. And I think one of the things the media missed was this shift in what works in media now versus what doesn't. We're kind of in the network phase, if you remember the thing from the network, Sybil the Soothsayer, all the kind of things. And I think the media has missed that and has not, either is acquiescing, I mean, what ABC did, I understand why they did it, but it's certainly what, they didn't have to do that. What Paramount is considering right now, which is owner 60 Minutes is just astonishing to watch them do this. And what a lot of people, in terms of giving in or being harassed by these lawsuits that they're getting, is a really dangerous time. That said, you are seeing a lot of incredible pushback by media in a really exciting way, actually.
And that's, you touched on both ways in which this is working, right? There are these lawsuits that are being settled, and the intimidation, I think we've heard from all three of you in each area. There's some extent to which this is working, right? There are law firms that made compromises, and I think universities have, to varying degrees, not had a sense of how to necessarily push back on some of the funding cuts, et cetera. But maybe we can just go down the line, Dawn, starting with you, and then we'll go to Bill and Kara. But to what extent is this working, right? Where are you seeing the pushback having effect, and where do you still think there are ongoing threats and/or consequences that are irreparable, right? To some extent, even if you win the lawsuit down the line, just the executive order itself has some damaging effect. So what are your thoughts in the law firm context?
Yeah, for the law firms, sadly, I think it worked. Not only is it working, it worked. Because every law firm that received an executive order or thought that it might understood that if the firm stood up and challenged it, that they would win. I mean, these are like, I've done some hard cases in my life. I've done some easy cases in my life. This is the easiest case I have ever done, the Sussman-Godfrey case. It is so obviously a blatant violation of the Constitution. So the law firm, and every law firm knew that. And so that wasn't their judgment. Their judgment was, if we, for the law firms that got the executive orders, if we fight, what is it going to mean for our business? And I do try to put myself in the shoes of the firm leaders who decided to settle. And I think, the best case that can be made for it is, well, we have a fiduciary obligation, not only to our other law firm partners, but we may have thousands of employees, and we have clients, and and if we don't settle, we could put all of that at risk. One law firm leader described it, the executive order, as an existential threat. My own 2 cents on it is, they might have suffered some consequences, bad consequences, had they stood up and fought. But the idea that it was an existential threat, that it was going to end the law firm, I just don't think that's true. I don't think it's close to true. It might, the economic consequences might have been significant for a while. But it did show you, what the authors of this strategy with the law firms were very smart, because I think they understood that if they could prevent collective action by picking off certain firms and isolating them and making them feel like they were at risk, then the profession wouldn't band together, wouldn't stand up for its independence, its role in our system, for the rule of law itself, that they wouldn't do it. And that, unfortunately, even apart from these law firms that made their deals, one of the things I did, as you mentioned at the outset, Ally, was I was asked by the leadership of the Perkins Coie firm, when they got hit with their executive order, if I would try to organize an effort on behalf of the nation's law firms to come in as an amicus friend of the court and basically stand up for the rule of law and collectively. And for about 3 weeks, I was on the phone morning, noon, and night, 9, 10 hours a day, talking to law firm leaders, trying to persuade them to join this brief. And while ultimately there were a very large number of firms, 500 plus firms joined the first brief, it was up to 800 in the second brief, 8 of them were in the top 100 revenue earning firms in the country, 8 of them. And 4 of those 8 were people who had executive orders against them. And so basically had 4 firms on the top 100 firms in the country who were willing to stick their necks out for the values of the profession. And I cannot tell you how many times I heard over and over again from law firm leaders, well, I'm so glad you're doing this. I'm completely with you. I just can't convince my firm leadership to do it. Or, I'm completely with you. we'll join if you get the following 15 firms that join, which very often was like kind of a bring me the broomstick of the Wicked Witch of the West sort of request, you know. And you know,
By
they
the
were
way, she didn't do it.
Yeah.
Anyway.
But you know, they were sincere. You know, these were sincere conversations. These people believed it. They felt it. But you know, coming out of that experience for me, I realized just how significant the fear is. You know, how it was palpable in my conversations with these people. And I wonder now, a few months later, now that several law firms did stand up and that the courts are weighing in decisively in favor of the Constitution, the unconstitutionality of the government, of the executive action, maybe the dynamic would be different now. I don't know. But it was a disheartening thing to have all of those conversations and then realizing in the back of their minds, they're all kind of saying, well, you know, if Don does this and if these other firms fight, we'll get the legal rulings we need and we don't have to put our names out there ourselves and we'll get them. You know, it was sort of, nobody said that, but, you know, at some level, they knew that that's what was going on. They understood that this effort was going to be made and they didn't need to join it in order to benefit from it. It's human nature in some ways, I guess, but it's sort of a sad side of human nature. And I do worry for the profession. You know, this was a really important moment to stand up for what the legal profession is supposed to be about and what it is, the role it's supposed to perform in society. And while hundreds and hundreds of law firms had the courage to do that around the country, most of the leading law firms didn't. And you know, that's a sad thing. I hope it's a temporary thing and that we'll see a resurgence in the future, but I worry about it.
And there was a similar letter, you know, to the amicus brief, Bill, that I saw go around from law school deans, sort of affirming commitment to DEI. And I noticed something similar, which was there were a lot of university deans on there. I was proud to see my dean on there, but a lot, if you went through the rankings, a lot of the top law school deans did not join that letter. And then there have been obviously the ongoing particular attacks with Columbia and Harvard. And I'm wondering, what do you think about the state of academia, legal education, and these attacks on universities more broadly? Are you feeling like things are moving in a more positive direction after your letter, or not as much as you might have hoped?
So a couple of things. First of all, you know, I think doing the right thing is courageous, but it's also contagious. And you know what we're seeing is when people stand up, other people follow. And you know, so you know, you talked about the administration's theory is that they flood the zone. The people opposing the administration can flood the zone too. You know, and so I have to say I was very. So I was working on the letter of law school deans, and it was focused on law firms. And it said to the administration, what you are doing is unconstitutional. You are trying to take away the right to counsel. And I have to say, I thought that was such a vanilla letter. And, you know, and I made a lot of calls. And, you know, there are 203 law schools in the country, and we got 69 deans to sign. And I have to say, you know, I mean, when I came in, there was like 20, and they were going to go forward. I said, you can't do that. You know, that's an embarrassment. 69 is not great. You know, what it means is it's about a third of the law school deans signed on for something that's obviously right. Now, at the same time, you know, with all these things, there's a tipping point. So so Harvard did the right thing, right? Now, I also have to say, you know, if you look what was being demanded of them, it would be hard not to do the right thing. You know, because they were essentially saying, we want to put Harvard under receivership. You know, and so, you know, people I know at Harvard were actually expecting that the administration would cave. But then when they saw what was being demanded of them, you know, Harvard stood strong because it was really about taking away their right to be a university. There was a letter that was from university presidents supporting Harvard. And it was very slow going at first. When I talked to people, they said, when we go to university presidents, when we had like 10 signatures, they said, why should I stand out? I'm not going to sign. Why should I stand out? But then when they got 100, then the train was leaving the station and everybody wanted to be on board, right? Because for the same reason, they said, why should I stand out? So, I think, again, with all of these things, I think the tipping point is, we have to push, because eventually, I hope, we will be reaching a tipping point in all these areas. The other thing just to be aware of is, there's the administration is being remarkably strategic. So, they go against, the kind of the idea is you kind of pick the strong person, and you force them to comply, and then everybody else complies because they think, I can't stand up. So ABC.
It's not really strong.
Well, it's all relative. But I mean, they pick somebody who, like Paul Weiss.
That's definitely what they did with the law firms.
I mean, with the law
definitely.
firms, it's like, Paul Weiss is a super, super profitable law firm, and it's a Democratic law firm with the former Attorney General as a partner, right? And if they can get Paul Weiss to say, okay, you win, then other firms say, how can we stand up if Paul Weiss caves? And they gave everybody else permission to cave. So, I think we're, the next big issue is, I mean, according to the Times, I think today, Harvard is talking. And, the pressure on them is enormous. But, if Harvard gives in, I think every university in America will say, Harvard, with its almost literally infinite resources, gave in. We will have to give in as well. So I think, in all of these situations, it's really crucial that people don't do, like Paul Weiss is like, we're a $2 billion enterprise, $40 million of pro bono work. That's a rounding error, right? But, this is a time in which democracy is under threat and it is at risk, and it is important, it is crucial to do the right thing.
Absolutely.
I have a little different attitude. I agree. I'm not surprised at all that the most high earning firms do this. They love their money. Like, they're so poor, all they have is money, really, in a lot of ways. And so the ones that always give in are the ones that are protecting their shareholder value. Like Mark Zuckerberg, I absolutely knew he was showing up at that inaugural and smiling away. And, and some of them try their best to do it and not embarrass themselves, like Sam Altman and Tim Cook were hiding in the back behind Marion Adelson, if you noticed. When I asked about that, because I thought they should have been in the front row, someone from one of the companies said it was the greatest feat of engineering in history. But I don't feel like that. I think that they will win temporarily, right? First of all, I'm sorry to point this out, but Donald Trump is old. He is real old, and he is not getting younger. Secondly, every time he is not present, and by the way, his polls are diminishing, every time he is not present, they lose. Like, we don't have a sense of, Reagan seemed impenetrable, and then we had years and years of Obama and Clinton. This is not, and I'm not comparing Reagan in that way, but they did some pretty terrible things, as I recall, especially to gay people. But one of the things that I always stick with is that he's old. His children are village idiots, so we're not getting this long dictatorship of the Trump family. It's just not happening. It just doesn't seem to be happening. And wherever he's not present, including with the world's richest man, they lose. He lost in Wisconsin. He should have won there if everything was so hunky-dory, they should have won there. And they didn't. They put money, they put means. He put on a cheese head, which made him look ridiculous. And I just don't feel, I think one of the things you have to do is absolutely, these people are making the threats. The question is, how long can they keep up the threats? And I'm a student of history, and one of the things I pay a lot of attention to is the fact that, one, the world always spins forward, even if it seems as if it doesn't. Two, every dictator ends up dead in a hole. They do. Just look at it. They end up dead in a hole. And I don't mean Donald Trump's going to die, but that's where these things tend to end up in the end. This country is a vibrant, diverse country compared to a lot of the countries that were subject, whether it's Romania or Germany or whatever. That's another thing I pay attention to. But the one I pay attention to the most is holding on to power is really difficult over the long terms, especially if you have a bunch of people that are pushing back even at the small level. And it seems to me journalists have never been liked. So it's not like we care, right? Like that's one thing that's kind of interesting. It's just those suits, you know, whoever they happen to be, whose businesses are diminishing. We don't care. We don't earn a lot of money. So it's not like we're protecting enormous value here. It's like it's going down and fast for many people, although I'm doing rather well. And eventually, people do stand up. And like I think of McCarthyism. Everyone's like, it's never been like this. I'm like, McCarthyism was kind of bad, and then the Salem witch trials wasn't a fun time, and oh yeah, the Whiskey Rebellion. And so you have to sort of look back. And the one thing I look at, and it's a journalistic thing, is I did a great interview with Yuval Harari, who I really love. I think he's really great. And his latest book I like more than the previous ones, although everybody liked the previous ones, or I like this one. One of the things he had in it, when the Gutenberg Bible was created, which was the internet of its time, right? It really was. I tell this story because people have to keep in mind that the history is long and our lives are short. Was the Gutenberg Bible comes out and everyone's like, it brought in the age of the Renaissance, it brought in knowledge, everybody got to do, no more monks writing on Bibles, etc. That didn't happen for hundreds of years after the Gutenberg Bible was created. We did not have the Renaissance. We did not have knowledge everywhere. We did not have all of a sudden Isaac Newton everywhere, that kind of stuff. What actually happened was the best, and it wasn't even the Bible that was the most popular, actually. The most popular book of right after the Gutenberg Press came in was a book called The Hammer of Witches. Look it up. It's this crazy guy wrote it. He obviously had mental illness, but he wrote this book called The Hammer of Witches, which was about how to find witches. Now, previously, there'd been a lot of women in certain small towns that did herbs and things like that to help people get better, et cetera. Mostly versions of, today you'd be Robert Kennedy's best friend. But that guy, wearables. We should all wear wearables. I call them unwearables. What a ridiculous person he is. And also dangerous. So this Hammer of Witches was a recipe book for killing women and bringing in the idea of a witch hunt, about evil, and some of it was comical. There's one part of it where women. He was alleging that women created a tree with a nest and they kept men's penises in it. That, swear to God, I was like, wow, that's quite a plot. But that was the idea, and that you could, if you were brave, you would go back and get your penis from the woman who took your penis. I'm like, does it come off? I know I'm gay, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't come off. That's okay, don't worry about it. And so what that was, all joking aside, was misinformation. It was propaganda. It was hatefulness. It was conspiracy theories. What happened then is what's happening today, right? And so we did okay after that, right? But this was the book. It created hundreds of thousands of women died during this time. The idea of a witch hunt didn't exist, speaking of Donald Trump's favorite thing, didn't exist. Conspiracy theories didn't exist. And what we're seeing now, and the thing I'm most concerned about, is if you took the Gutenberg Bible and put it on steroids with AI, that's the one. That's the worry I have. I'm not worried about the press. I'm not worried about this. I'm worried about AI being in the hands of some of the most stunted, emotional people and a small group of people, with Donald Trump deciding who wins and loses. That's what I'm focused on, because that's where everything is headed with AI, and AI supplanting media over time. It's not going to be social media. It's going to be AI, and that's going to be, and you're seeing moves by someone like Elon to correct Grok when it's accurate. We need to correct, we need to make it give the right answer, which isn't the right answer. It's the answer he wants. And so that's what I focus a lot on, is these people. Thank God Twitter is dying, but in a lot of ways, That's really where the game is, and that's where we need to be focusing when we're thinking about the future of media.
Well, I'm going to turn it open to audience
Now I'm
questions.
going to go back
in a
to my
minute.
nest. Penis nest.
Well, we'll come find you when we need you to come
would I
save
do
us
that? It's so crazy.
from whatever's coming next. It's a lot to think about. We're going to take some audience questions, but all of you, Kara, you as well, talking about people who stood up during McCarthy era and these examples of people standing up right now, mentioned the importance of that. Bill, you said courage is, what was your line about contagion?
contagious.
Yeah, it's contagious, right? So before we turn it over to audience questions, I thought maybe I'd just ask you each to quickly share, for those who might be affiliated in some way with these kinds of organizations. We have people who might be clients of law firms or employees or donors or alums of universities or readers, consumers of the press, or even if you don't have a connection to one of these organizations and you want to encourage the kind of leadership that you all are looking for and that you've exhibited yourselves. What might you say to people to give them that courage to do what they need to do, and what suggestions do you have about ways people can push back?
So, Bill's totally right about what he said. And I saw that in my own law firm, because before our law firm took on this work, there was serious discussion among the partners, and there was a pretty high level of fear among a lot of them, justifiably, I think. And there were some real skeptics, and it took a lot of work and a lot of discussion to get us to the point where we said, okay, we'll take on this amicus brief, we'll represent Sussman Godfrey, and then we've become one of the few law firms that actually taking on suits against the administration of all kinds. But once we decided to do it, a remarkable thing happened, which was several of the partners who were the most worried and the most skeptical became the most deeply invested in the work, and asked to become leaders of the work and move themselves into the forefront. And while it was a little bit grandiose to say it, but my colleagues saying, well, this is our finest hour. And so it's sort of to watch that process occur, to sort of move from fear to conviction to pride. It was pretty inspiring, really. And I've talked to lawyers at firms like WilmerHale and others that have decided to stand up and fight, and they all tell the same story. It was hard. There was a lot of fear. There was a lot of work to overcome that fear. But once we did, we felt great, and we felt like we were doing the right thing for the right reasons. And so I do think, to find hope in this situation, it's what Bill said, that the more people do it, the more people will be inspired to do it. And it's really important to think about it that way. And that just is the experience that I've lived doing this over the last several months.
So, I think I disagree. I really feel like democracy is at risk. And I think this is a time in which I think all of us should ask, when democracy was at risk, what did I do? And, there's no blueprint, but I think that's something that each of us should reflect on. And, it can range. I think the elections that are coming up this fall, I think will really matter in New Jersey and Virginia. I think if the Democrats win, I think there are a lot of, right now, every Republican in the House and Senate is afraid of being primaried. If they realize if there's a Democratic landslide, they'll maybe realize that there's a general election too. And maybe they shouldn't all be just afraid of being primaried. I think about who needs representation. Because I think one of the things that I think is very effective right now is that I think a lot of law firms are afraid of doing the kind of pro bono work that they did in the first Trump administration. So, think about, supporting groups that represent immigrants. Again, I think, these are, some things are big, some things are small, but it's important to do what you can. And one of the things that, sorry, I get a little emotional about this. One of the things that I saw that was so moving was during the No Kings protest. We live right down the street from, I think it's an assisted living community. And as we drove by, people were with walkers and on wheelchairs going to their protest. So I think pushing back and doing what you can is what we all have to do, and it's what we need today.
I think we actually do agree. Democracy is always under threat for me. I've always experienced that, and maybe it's a little different because 40 years ago, I'm gay. I wasn't going to have kids. I wasn't going to get married. This is whatever. I have 4 kids, so whatever. Good luck. It didn't work out that way, and it doesn't work out that way. And I do believe that there's a thing about bullies and losers is they always try to make you feel alone and isolated, and you're not. When you said you were surprised that everyone was positive towards you, I'm not surprised at all. They make you think by whatever happens on social media or whatever that that's reality, and it's not. Most people do want to stand out. Most people are good. There's a lot of bad people, that's for sure, but right now they're getting outsized attention because they're able to do so. If you looked at social media, and there's 10 of them is too many. You'd think everyone's a white supremacist. You think they have enormous power. You think everyone agrees with them. It is simply not true. It just isn't. They just are louder and noisier, and the noise gets in your head, and it's meant to do that. And one of the things, I had the world's richest man saying my heart was seething with hate. Like, I'm still here. Like, he's gone. See you later, Elon. Like, he didn't stick it out. And we just kept saying, this guy's crazy. This guy has a drug problem. This guy is making a mess of it. And the reporters kept jamming it away, and he's gone. World's richest man. There are ways to fight back against these people by simply stating what is. One of the things, when I was at Georgetown, I went to Georgetown University, there was a plaque, which I cannot find now, but it said, I believe what I see. I do not see what I believe. And you have to believe what you see and then say it. And I think it's the most important thing that journalists can do is continue to call it out. I'm a Christiane Amanpour fan, truthful, not neutral. Like, truthful, what is right in front of you. And if you keep saying that, there's absolutely, the American experience is, if you keep saying what's right in front of you and what you see, not what you believe, you always tend to end up in the right place. It's not a perfect place. It's a mess of a country in lots of ways, but it's also one of these countries where I would not have been able to do what I'm doing and having my family, and I think in almost any other country. And so, besides the ones in Europe, and you can do whatever you want there, and San Francisco. In San Francisco, you can marry a goat. We think it's great. You shouldn't, but whatever. And one of the things I always think about is when they push power at you, when they're very loud about it, I think they've lost. When they start to get really arrogant and really braggadocio. Trump, for example, we've obliterated. I was like, he totally didn't obliterate it. Like, it was so, and today the report came out, oops, he didn't obliterate it. Okay, whatever. But that's what they do. They push that. And I ran into one of the Elon people at one of these hotels, and I was like, I moved here before them, and I'm like, oh, you're here, you awful people. I ran away from Silicon Valley to get away from you, and now I see you in my supermarket. This sucks. And they said to me, because they're so arrogant, and they're like, oh, it looks like we won. And I looked at him and I said, you're still an asshole. And he looked at me and I go, have a good day. And I left. And I was like, doesn't matter. And eventually they're going to lose. So that's my experience with it. And I just feel like, I think we discount ourselves constantly. We act like we're alone, and I have no surprise that everybody supported you, zero. Of course they did, because most people are like that. So. And that's my mother on the phone telling me what's on Fox News tonight. So. But she's old, so just take where that goes. She's real old, so you're not gonna have to listen to her much longer. Tucker Carlson said it. It wasn't me. Tucker Carlson's the one that noted that.
Okay, here we go. Hi, I'm Ramsey, Pulse and Prose bookseller here. I'm curious, regarding censorship, do you think we can trace signs of our constitutional rights deteriorating, not only during Trump's current presidency, but also during Biden's presidency, especially pro-Palestinian university students against the Israeli genocide in Gaza, Palestine? I'm referring to students who were expelled or threatened to silence by the university faculty due to America's bipartisan support of Israel. Even now, for the recent release of Mahmoud Khalil, an activist who ICE arrested due to his stance on being anti-genocide for Palestinians, he clearly states both Democrats and Republicans are complicit in censorship of human rights for Palestinians. What are your thoughts on that?
You know, you can't, like, one of the things that was interesting recently with just this week about saying, about this War Powers Act and whether they were going to do this. One of the things we do on our podcast is we do call balls and strikes, and lots of presidents have done it. It's just that Trump is so violative of so many things, you can't take another thing that he's doing wrong, but other presidents have done this. So any instance of, and listen, Obama did a lot of things too in that regard, in terms of shutting down reporters, and if we don't say that, now look, it's not the same thing because it's not in such volume, it's not in such obvious thing, but every single group that has an interest in this country is going to try to shut down the speech of others. And it's not a new and fresh thing. And it's really important to, if you're a Democrat, to call it out on the Democratic side. It's really important to point it out. And what happened to him was repulsive. What happened to that young woman at Columbia? Repulsive. She should be able to say, and I had a friend who was from Guinea, West Africa. She's been in this country, she has a green card for a long, long time. She's been here a long, long time, and she traveled, she came back and stopped at the airport. And for hours. And they're like, we want to look at your phone. And which is the tactic they use for international students, or whoever they're trying to get at, is that right now Rubio is trying to do this. What does anti-American mean? The whole idea of America is you get to say terrible things, right? Or things people don't agree with. And my friend, which I love her for, although she took an enormous risk, was they said, we want to see your phone. And she goes, I'm not going to show. She had turned off the facial recognition and the fingerprint. And she refused. She goes, I'm not showing you my phone. And they're like, well, we're going to wait here. And she goes, then we're going to wait here because you have no right to go into my phone. And at one point, one of the ICE officers said to her, you speak really well for an immigrant. And she goes, you don't speak very well for a citizen. And I love that. So I think it should be called out wherever it happens. It just happens the Trump people are very bad, comparatively.
But we're seeing things that we didn't see under the Biden administration. I mean, the woman from Tufts, who was walking and who's surrounded by ICE agents who are plain clothes and masks.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think what we're seeing now is for me is kind of a new level of just absolutely terrifying. And I mean when I travel, I now have a burner phone. I mean, 2 years ago, I thought, I'm going to China. Do I get a burner phone? I thought, oh, you're being ridiculous. Now when I travel, I have a burner phone. So, I mean, I think what we're seeing right now is really, it's a new level of concern that is, I mean, for me, it's terrifying.
I think the point he's making, though, is like, look, Clinton did don't ask, don't tell, like, right? Come on. Like, it's endemic for our country. It's just there is more of it now and everywhere, and I think that's the problem. But we should call it out every single time we see it in whatever, even if we, agree with it. You're sort of seeing it in New York right now, which is really incredible, what's going on. Whoever you like, again, I see why you might not like one or the other, but the kind of nonsense that's going on there is really kind of ridiculous. Just let people choose who they want to have. That's really the way voting goes, whatever side you're on. So.
Okay, I think I see a lot of people have questions, so I'm going to take at least one from over here and one from over here so that we can start to bundle them so we have some time to try to get through as many as we can.
All right, I'll be quick. I do have one statement for you, for Bill especially. I graduated from the Naval Academy 32 years ago. John McCain spoke at my graduation, and I'll never forget one of his lines. And he was talking about getting through a prisoner of war camp, and he said, I have seen how profoundly the human condition is empowered by the standards of our tradition, and it was just something that stuck with me. I can remember it verbatim for 32 years. But my question is the opposite of just taking some of the actions that they've taken. There's also been a decision not to enforce a law, like the TikTok law, right? So not. My daughter might throw a phone at me, but yeah, I'm just curious if you see that the decision not to enforce a law passed by Congress and approved by the Supreme Court is a danger as well.
Great question. And then we'll take one over here, and you all can respond to both of them together.
Hello. I actually have a small question and a larger question. And one is that we have heard that some of the law firms that caved to Trump are losing a lot of their partners. And I wondered if it was making a difference. And the second question is, do you think the justice system will stop Trump or be able to stop him? I know that's a big question. Big question.
So, on the small question, and I'll say something about the big question too, but on the small question, I think the law firms, some of them are going to suffer some harms. Some really good people have left some of the firms, and I suspect some more really good people will leave some. I don't think it's going to lead to the collapse of those firms or anything like it. So I think I think the damage for those firms is over the long term to their reputations and to their ability to try to claim the high ground, the rule of law in the future. I think that's where they've really hurt themselves. But short term economically, I don't think so. And then in terms of will the judiciary be able to stop the administration? Time will tell. I think for people who coming from where I'm coming from, we're going to lose some cases, and they're going to seem heartbreaking, and we're going to win some others. And the hope will be that we'll win enough that we won't all feel like that the constitutional system is completely fallen apart and that we just have an authoritarian executive branch. I'm optimistic that that's how it's going to turn out, but it's going to take a lot of work, and it's not going to be uniform, I don't think. I think there's going to be disappointments and some big ones along the way, but I'm hopeful that when we're done, we'll look back on this and say that the system held, the judiciary held, but it's not going to be easy for that to happen.
So on both questions, what we're seeing now is an administration that's saying we don't have to follow the law. So whether it's in the TikTok case or Vice President Vance, and we've never heard that before. So when we're looking at the challenges that we're facing today, that's one of the most powerful and significant. I think when we're thinking about long term, because I am at the end of the day, I am optimistic. I mean, I think we both have to realize how serious this is and that it's not inevitable, but I am optimistic. But I think long term we have to do civic education in a way that we've abandoned, because I think, for so many people, particularly younger people, it's like, well, the president says this, the court says that, it's kind of a you pick 'em. That's not the way our government works. And I think, we have to do a better job of making people aware why that's important. I think, at the end of the day, I think there are two things. I think the courts will be crucial. We're not going to win all of them. I'm optimistic that we will win the crucial ones. That's key. But I also just want to highlight, it's we have an uncertainty there because of a lack of respect for the rule of law that we've never encountered. Nixon turned over the tapes, right? I have no confidence that in the same case Trump would turn over the tapes. And then so one of the con law professors when I was in law school, Charlie Black, who was kind of one of the great professors, one of the students said, suppose Nixon didn't turn over the tapes, what would have happened? And he said, well, it depends on who the colonels support. And he said, but that will never happen. So, again, I think there's at risk. I think that it's crucial. I think the courts are crucial. I am ultimately optimistic that in the biggest cases, the courts will do the right thing. And again, I think it is so crucial that there is a sense in this country that we are standing for the values that have created our democracy, because I think that will be really so powerful in deciding whether what the court decisions are stand. And again, when we talk about mobilization, that is essential.
I'll answer the TikTok question quickly. I mean, China's never going to let it go. It's just not going to happen. And the Trump administration has the investors in TikTok are largely U.S. rich people who are friends of Trump's, and so they're not going to do anything. And I wrote a piece about 7 years ago in the New York Times where I said I love TikTok, best new product. I use it on a burner phone because of the Chinese Communist Party. I think nothing will happen. And by the way, I don't think Congress exactly bathed itself in glory over that decision in terms of doing anything. So in that case, I largely blame Congress for that. It shouldn't be in Trump's hands, and we should be thinking of national security issues and everything else. But, water under bridge with this thing. They're not going to do anything, and nobody really cares because we're on, it's backed up between 10 other things. And eventually, I think Mike Waltz and J.D. Vance were in charge of that deal, and Mike had some signal problems. And J.D. Vance, whatever, he doesn't, whatever. Good luck, J.D. Charmless. You think he's going to be president? I don't. He's totally charmless. And kind of short also. By the way, tall people become president. They do, unfortunately, because I'll never be president, I guess. But TikTok, nothing's going to happen. Nothing. And Congress probably shouldn't have passed the law the way they did because they didn't do enough homework for everybody, even though I do think TikTok is a propaganda threat to our country. And the last thing I would say is I think young people actually are great. I think the problem we have is 25 to 47-year-old people. I think they're the ones with their hair on fire. And I find young people quite very clearly stepping up in lots of ways. I have young son. I mean, I have a lot of kids, but the two older ones I think are very educated about stuff. And the one time I find hope is when I talk to young people. That's when I feel good about our democracy.
Yeah, so just one kind of follow-up as an educator. Trump is actually good for law schools. So, because, I think there was a period in which people thought law doesn't really matter. It's about finance, it's about entertainment, law doesn't really matter. And then in 2017, applications skyrocketed, right? And they are skyrocketing again.
Congratulations.
So Georgetown, it is. So we have 14,000 applicants this year.
Wow.
So, so again, and I think that is
and only half for MAGA? What? Which half?
No, but it's a reflection of, this is a time, and I think this is right. So, I mean, I would say both are true, that we have not done a good job of educating people about the fundamentals of civics, but I think they also realize that it matters.
Yeah. Judge Janine's not going to give you a hard time, is she? Judge Janine isn't.
We'll find out.
I doubt it. She's got other things to drink.
We'll take one more question over here and want to get your question.
I'm trying to
as well.
wrap my brain around 14,000 applications.
It's amazing.
Mind-numbing. So this is. Thank you all so much for being willing to come and have this conversation. This is very much appreciated as a teach-in. You can see it's a pretty good crowd all the way back into the stacks. This is more of a legal question. There have been a metric ton of executive orders. And they're not exactly the same as law, right? Theoretically, the next guy who sits in the seat can reverse it all. Right, next human who sits in that seat can reverse it all. But they've been very strategically clever in how they've gone about rolling all these things out. I'm using the grand they. I don't think I need to define that here. And they're dismantling a lot of the infrastructure What kind of legal options are there aside from, I feel like we're fighting one brick at a time, right? Like one court case for one executive order. Well, there's so many of them. It's going to be over by the time we go through all those court cases just because the courts can't keep up. what legal options are there now, and what legal options might we have as time goes on? Certainly at the end of this administration, to be able to rebuild some of the damage or recover from some of the damage or some of the shifts that have occurred, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Yes, and we can just grab this question over here too, and then we can answer them together.
Hi, first I'd just like to thank you all for coming to speak to us. I could ask you a million questions. I wish I could talk to you for hours. So apologies if this question isn't super concise. But obviously I'm a pretty young person, 23, so I was in high school during Trump 1, college for Biden, and Trump 2 as a young adult working. So I am pretty scared that we're going through a period of change in the world and in our society, one with a new technology, AI, that might revolutionize how society operates in a way that the Industrial Revolution did in the past, or the Gutenberg Bible and the printing press did. And there are periods that led to a lot of violence and change, which is very difficult to live through, even if in the long run it seemed like everything got better. So I guess my question is, with all these changes happening, this is my first time going through the change or the maybe threat to democracy, but what kind of steps can we take as individuals, or even like as members of institutions, to fight back against, or to like, if the world is going in a new direction, how can we get ahead of that and not let evil or malign forces take advantage of it?
With AI, it shouldn't be in the hands of 4 companies. It's like, but then it was, the railroads were, AT&T was. We managed to deal with that at the time. Whatever had happened to the banks, there was always concentration of power. Rich people like to do that. They like to control everything. And so we should, I mean, one of the people I interviewed was Amy Klobuchar, who's been trying to pass I'm not an antitrust law expert, but not having renovated it in 100 years is a problem going forward, and the challenge we face. I think we have to, as citizens, realize that, first of all, we paid for the internet and they gained, right? Now Jeff Bezos is in Venice right now, spending $21 million on a friggin' wedding, which, good luck. It's good for you. I'm so happy for you. But the fact of the matter is, the U.S. taxpayer paid for the internet, paid for it, and they benefited from it. We can't allow AI, which was started in the government long ago. It was started by universities. It was gelled by people that were paid for by the U.S. government to be benefiting only a small amount of people, and the decision making cannot be concentrated. And so one of the things we have to push back on legally, legislatively, in regulations, is to create guardrails that are good for all of humanity and across the globe. And that's one thing that I've been pushing for, is that these people cannot. If you knew them, you definitely wouldn't want them running this stuff. But a small group of homogeneous people, we know what happens in nature when it's homogeneous. You know, you end up with it just doesn't work biologically, just to have homogeneity. And so one of the things that we have to start to do is understand that this is ours and we should have control of it. In AI, it's really critical. And everything is tending towards the power group people right now, especially under Trump, because he feels like he can hand out things like, you know, like candy, essentially. And so that's one of the things that young people have to push back on, especially with legislators, regulators, and lawsuits and everything else. So I would focus on that and just AI. I don't know about the other stuff at all.
Don and Will, do you want to talk about the executive orders and maybe this broader question about change? And then I think we probably need to wrap it up. So, but we'll end on that note, which I think is a great question to end on.
So for me, the question about what are we going to have to do is a really hard question, because in some sense it's true. You know, there's been this avalanche of executive action. There's going to be more. A lot of bad things have happened. You take something like USAID, where they, just a really important part of our foreign relations work was destroyed in a matter of weeks before anybody could do anything about it. But to the extent that people are, and they are, fighting now, not all of those executive orders are going to be successful. A lot of them are going to be blocked. But the ones that are going to do a great deal of damage. And then, in the event, as I hope we will be in the situation come 2029, we're going to face a really important and hard decision, I think. And because I think to the extent that this administration and its values and its views are voted out, and a new way of thinking and a new way of operating is voted in 2029, there's going to be a lot of pressure to seek retribution against the people who have carried out what is being carried out now. They deserve it. And there's going to be, and that may well be right. But there's also going to be, and I think this is what makes it so hard, an enormous, enormous amount of rebuilding that's going to have to be done. And I just think that, you know, it's just not too soon to start thinking about that. And, you know, how are we going to balance those two things? How are we going to make sure that we repudiate the deep wrongs that are occurring now, while at the same time we devote the energy and the spirit and the forward-looking optimism that we're going to need to rebuild. And I see that as a really big challenge, not an insurmountable one, but I think that's how it looks to me.
You know, I mean, think about Project 2025. So, you know, that's 4 years of thinking about when you get power, what do you do? And what has been astonishing is the way in which a very short period of time there has been realization of that blueprint. So I think one of the things that, you know, we should be thinking about is, what does a Project 2029 look like? You know, and, you know, when you are creating new executive orders, when you are passing new legislation, when you're trying to restore the civil service that has been gutted, you know, how do you do that? And this is the moment to start thinking about that, right? So again, I think you know, we have all different roles to play, you know, whether it's in the voting or supporting people representing immigrants, or in law firms, or in journalism. I think we all have a role to play, but I hope that, I am ultimately optimistic, and I think it is crucial at this point to think, you know, in the future, how do we create the America that we want our America to be?
Can I make one point, though? Even though he was worried about democracy, he did write that letter, although I suspect you wrote it over there.
Just the good parts.
Just for, he wrote that letter. He has a lot to risk. He's a fancy dean. He had a lot at risk. He wrote the letter, and guess what he did? He pushed send. So I'm completely optimistic, because everyone pushes send.
Well, I agree with our last question asker that we could talk all night. There's so much more to hear from you all about, but unfortunately our time is beyond up. So I want to thank you all for being here with us today. You all who came out. And if you enjoyed this event tonight, I wanted to let you know there are some upcoming Politics and Prose events that you might also be interested in. There's programming around the Declaration of Independence, which turns 250 years old next year. There's also a class on the Bill of Rights, and the October Salon, which will be in the Coffee House, is about the Supreme Court's recent decisions and the upcoming term. And one final thank you to all the PNP staff for their hard work putting this event together. And to give them a little extra help on getting out the door, if you could please fold up your chair if you have a folding chair, and just rest it against one of the bookshelves or the walls before you go. Thanks so much.